On the second Saturday of April, 1971, Earl Maddox drove his pickup truck and cattle trailer 40 miles to the Sedalia Livestock Auction in Pettis County, Missouri. He had $600 in his pocket, money he'd saved over 2 years, money his wife Lorraine didn't know about, money earmarked for exactly this day. Earl had been waiting for this auction since October, when he'd received a letter from France. The auction barn was crowded that morning. Spring was calving season, and farmers from 3 counties had come to buy and sell breeding stock. The smell of hay and manure and coffee hung in the air, mixing with cigarette smoke and the constant low murmur of men talking cattle. Earl found a seat in the back, away from the main crowd. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He wanted to watch. The lots came through one by one. Hereford bulls with thick necks and solid frames, Black Angus cows heavy with calf, a few dairy animals that drew less interest. Earl watched the bidding, watched the prices, watched the patterns. Most bulls were selling between $300 and $500. The premium animals, the ones with documented bloodlines and proven offspring, went higher, sometimes touching $800. Then Lot 47 came into the ring. The bull was different from everything else that had sold that morning. Where the Herefords were red and white, this animal was pale cream, almost white, with a pinkish tint to its skin. Where the Angus were thick and blocky, this bull was lean, almost rangy, with a long body and a narrow head. Its ribs were visible beneath the pale hide. Its hip bones jutted out. The auctioneer's voice dropped slightly, the way it does when even he knows the lot isn't going to draw much interest. Lot 47, gentlemen. Young bull, approximately 18 months, breed listed as... He squinted at the paper. Charolais. That's a French breed. For those unfamiliar, we'll start the bidding at $100. Silence. $100, gentlemen. Breeding age bull. Let's see some hands. Nothing. All right, $50. Who'll give me 50? Earl raised his hand. $50 from the gentleman in back. Do I hear 60? A farmer in the front row turned around to look at who had bid. His face showed confusion, then amusement. He nudged his neighbor. $60. Anyone? No one moved. 60? This is a breeding bull, gentlemen. $50 going once. Earl raised his hand again. 75. The auctioneer paused. Sir, you're bidding against yourself. I know. $75. Now people were definitely looking. The low murmur of conversation had stopped. Earl could feel the attention shifting to him. Feel the eyes and the judgment. $75 then. Going once, going twice, and that's when Glenn Kirby stood up. Let me tell you about Glenn Kirby, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Glenn Kirby was the John Deere dealer in Sedalia, had been for 15 years, since he'd inherited the business from his father-in-law. He was a big man, the kind of big that comes from good eating and not much physical labor, with a red face and a loud voice and an opinion on everything. Glenn considered himself an expert on all things agricultural. Tractors, of course, that was his business, but also crops, weather, politics, and livestock, especially livestock. Glenn had grown up on a cattle farm, and even though he'd left that life for the dealership, he never missed a chance to remind people of his expertise. He was also, in the way of small-town businessmen who've had too much success too easily, a bully. Not a physical bully, Glenn was soft beneath the bluster, but a social bully, the kind who maintained his status by putting others down, by making jokes at the expense of quieter men, by positioning himself as the arbiter of what was smart and what was stupid. And right now, Glenn Kirby saw an opportunity. He stood up from his seat in the middle of the auction barn, turned to face the crowd, and raised his voice so everyone could hear. $75 for that? Earl, you better dig that grave now while the ground's soft. That animal won't see July. The barn erupted in laughter. Glenn wasn't finished. He was enjoying himself now, playing to the crowd. Tell you what, Earl, I'll sell you a shovel at cost. You're gonna need it. That bull's got one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. More laughter. Someone slapped their knee. Ray Morrison, the banker from First National, joined in. He was sitting near Glenn, and he'd never liked Earl much. Too quiet, too independent, too reluctant to take on debt. "Earl, you want to light $75 on fire? You could at least get some warmth out of it. That thing there, all you're going to get is vet bills and a burial." The laughter got louder. Earl could see men pointing, nudging each other, shaking their heads. Tom Garrison, his nearest neighbor, was grinning like he'd just heard the funniest joke of his life. "Maybe it's a dairy bull," Tom shouted. "Skinny like that might give some milk." "French breed," someone else called out. "Maybe Earl wants to make some fancy cheese." The whole barn was laughing now. The auctioneer was trying to maintain order, but couldn't hide his own smile. Even the handlers in the ring were grinning. Earl Maddox stood in the back of the barn, his bid number still in his hand, and said nothing. He didn't argue, he didn't explain, he didn't defend himself. He just waited for the laughter to die down, walked to the clerk's window, paid his $75, and loaded the skinny cream-colored bull into his trailer. As he drove out of the parking lot, he could still hear Glenn Kirby's voice, loud enough to carry through the closed windows of his truck. "Dead by July. You heard it here first. Let me tell you about the letter from France, because that's where this story really begins." Earl Maddox had a cousin named Pierre Dubois. Pierre's mother was Earl's mother's sister. She'd married a French soldier after the First World War and moved to a village in the Burgundy region of France. Earl had never met Pierre in person, but they'd exchanged letters occasionally over the years, the way distant relatives do. In October of 1968, Pierre had written a letter that changed Earl's life. Pierre worked for a livestock cooperative in France, helping to manage the breeding programs for several large cattle operations. He wasn't a farmer himself, but he understood the business, understood what made some bloodlines valuable and others ordinary. "There's something happening here that you should know about," Pierre had written, "a breed of cattle called Charolais. They've been bred in France for centuries, but only for local markets. Now the Americans are starting to import them. The Canadians too, and I think they're going to change everything about how beef cattle are raised in North America." Earl had written back, asking for more information. Pierre's next letter in December 1968 was longer, 5 pages, handwritten, explaining what made Charolais special. "The breed is different from what you're used to. They don't look like Herefords or Angus. They're leaner, longer, lighter in color. To someone who only knows traditional American breeds, they might look sick or underdeveloped. But that's exactly why they're valuable. Charolais cattle convert feed into muscle more efficiently than almost any other breed. They gain weight faster, reach market size sooner, and produce leaner meat with less fat. The carcass yield is higher, more sellable beef per pound of live weight. But here's the important part. The breed is still rare in America. Only a few thousand head in the whole country, mostly in Canada and Texas. The bloodlines are tightly controlled. A proven Charolais bull with documented breeding can sell for $5,000, sometimes more. In 10 years, maybe 15, Charolais genetics will be everywhere. They'll crossbreed them with Herefords and Angus to improve the whole American beef herd. The people who control the bloodlines now will make fortunes. Watch for Charolais at your local auctions. Most American cattlemen don't recognize them yet. They see a pale, lean animal and think it's sick or stunted. But if you can find one at a low price, if you can start building a breeding program before everyone else catches on, you could be sitting on something very valuable. Earl had read that letter so many times that the paper was starting to wear thin at the folds. He'd done his own research, too, written to the American International Charolais Association, read every article he could find in livestock magazines, talked to a veterinarian in Kansas City who'd actually seen Charolais cattle in Canada. Everything Pierre said checked out. So when Lot 47 came into the ring at the Sedalia auction, a pale, lean, cream-colored bull that looked wrong to everyone who'd grown up with Herefords, Earl Maddox didn't see a sick animal. He saw an opportunity. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known something that everyone around you was convinced was wrong? Have you ever watched people laugh at the truth because they couldn't see past their own assumptions? Earl Maddox could have defended himself. He could have explained about the French cousin, the letter, the research he'd done. He could have told Glenn Kirby and Ray Morrison and all the other laughing men exactly why this skinny cream-colored bull was going to be worth more than all their Herefords put together. He didn't say a word, not because he was humble, not because he couldn't think of a response. Earl stayed silent for a different reason, a reason his father had taught him years ago. When you know something other men don't, his father used to say, you have two choices. You can tell them the truth and watch them argue with you, doubt you, maybe even learn from you and become your competition. Or you can stay quiet, let them think you're a fool, and keep the advantage for yourself. Earl kept the advantage. Let me tell you about the first year with the bull, because it wasn't easy. Earl named him Blanc, the French word for white, and housed him in a separate pen away from his small Hereford herd. The bull was young, just 18 months old, and needed time to fill out before he could start breeding. Lorraine Maddox had questions. What kind of animal is that? She asked the first morning, looking at Blanc through the fence. He doesn't look like our other cattle. French breed, Charolais. He looks sick, Earl. He's not sick. He's just different. Lorraine gave her husband the look that wives give when they know something isn't being said, but decide not to push. $75? That's right. One could have been $75 toward a new stove. Could have been. Lorraine shook her head and walked back to the house. The neighbors came by over the following weeks, curious, mostly, but also ready to deliver the mockery they'd been preparing since the auction. Tom Garrison stopped his truck at the fence line, leaned out the window, and called out to Earl in the pasture. Still alive, I see. You're already past Glenn's deadline. July, wasn't it? Earl just waved and kept working. What are you feeding him? Looks like he needs about 50 pounds of grain a day to catch up to a real bull. Earl ignored him. The veterinarian, Dr. Warren, came out in June for the regular herd check. He examined Blanc carefully, running his hands over the pale hide, checking the animal's teeth and eyes and hooves. This is a Charolais, Dr. Warren said, and Earl heard something in his voice. Recognition. Interest. Where did you find him? Sedalia auction. How much? $75. Dr. Warren whistled. Do you know what you've got here? I know. Most people wouldn't. Most people would look at this animal and see a sick bull. I know. They told me. Dr. Warren finished his examination, packed up his bag, and turned to Earl with an expression that was half admiration, half calculation. You planning to breed him? When he's ready. Year or so. Keep him healthy. Keep him away from diseases. If this animal lives up to his genetics, you could have something special. Dr. Warren paused. Don't tell anyone. Not yet. Let them keep thinking he's a failure. Earl smiled. That's the plan. Let me tell you about the first calf, because that's when Earl knew for certain that Pierre had been right. In the spring of 1973, Blanc was old enough to breed. Earl introduced him to 3 of his best Hereford cows, carefully selected females with good frames and proven fertility. He kept the breeding secret, not telling anyone which bull had sired which calves. The calves were born in January and February of 19... They didn't look like any calves the neighbors had ever seen. Instead of the traditional red and white coloring of Herefords, these calves were pale, cream-colored like their father, or a washed-out tan that came from mixing the Charolais white with Hereford red. They were leaner than normal calves, longer in the body, with the same narrow heads as Blanc. Tom Garrison saw them through the fence one March morning and stopped his truck again. What the hell happened to your calves, Earl? They look sick. You got some kind of disease in your herd? They're fine. They don't look fine. They look like someone drained the color out of them. You should call Dr. Warren. Dr. Warren's seen them. They're healthy. Tom shook his head. Your funeral, Earl. Those animals won't bring 10 cents at market looking like that. But when fall came, and Earl took his first Charolais cross calves to market, they didn't bring 10 cents. They brought a premium. The cattle buyer, a man from Kansas City who worked for one of the big meat packing companies, took one look at Earl's calves and separated them from the rest of the lot. "These are Charolais crosses, aren't they?" "That's right. First ones I've seen at this market." The buyer walked around the calves, examining them from every angle. Lean, good frame, long body. These are going to dress out beautiful, high yield, less waste, exactly what the packers are looking for. "What's the price?" The buyer named a figure that was 15% higher than what ordinary Hereford calves were bringing that day. Earl didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, collected his check, and drove home. That winter, he bred Blanc to 6 more cows. Now let me tell you about the expansion, because Earl Maddox was about to become the most successful cattleman in Pettis County. By 1976, Earl had figured out the system. The pure Charolais calves, the ones with Blanc as both sire and grandsire, were too valuable to sell for beef. Instead, he kept the females for breeding and began selling the males as breeding bulls to other farmers. The first bull he sold, in the spring of 1977, went for $1,200. The buyer was from Kansas, a rancher named Howard Wells who had read about Charolais genetics in a livestock magazine and driven 300 miles to see Earl's operation. Howard walked through the pastures, examined the cattle, asked questions about bloodlines and birth weights and feed conversion. "You've got the real thing here," Howard said. "Documented Charolais, traceable to French bloodlines. Do you know how rare that is in this part of the country?" "I know." "Where did you get the original bull?" "Auction." "How much?" Earl paused. $75. Howard laughed, not the mocking laugh of the Sedalia auction, but the delighted laugh of a man who appreciates a good deal. $75. And now you're selling his sons for $1,200. Seems that way. You're going to be a wealthy man, Mr. Maddox. Earl shrugged. I'm going to be a cattle farmer. Same as always. But the numbers were changing. By 1978, Earl had expanded his Charolais breeding program to 30 head. By 1980, he was selling 5 or 6 bulls a year at prices that ranged from $2,000 to $5,000, depending on the animal's conformation and bloodline documentation. The neighbors noticed. Tom Garrison was the first to come asking questions. The same Tom Garrison who'd mocked Earl's sick calves 5 years earlier. "Earl, I've been watching your operation. Those Charolais cattle of yours, I've been reading about them. The market's really taking off, seems to be. I was wondering, maybe I could buy a breeding bull from you, get some of that genetics into my own herd." Earl looked at his neighbor for a long moment. He remembered the truck stopping at the fence line, the jokes about sick calves, the laughter that had followed him home from every trip to town. "I sell bulls at the spring sale. You're welcome to bid like everyone else. I was hoping maybe you could give me a neighbor discount. We go back a long way, Earl." "We do go back a long way, Tom. I remember every mile of it." He didn't offer the discount. "Let me tell you about Glenn Kirby, because he's the one who matters most in this story." By 1983, Glenn Kirby's John Deere dealership was struggling. The farm crisis had hit Missouri hard. Interest rates through the roof. Commodity prices in the basement. Farmers going bankrupt left and right. Nobody was buying new tractors. Glenn was barely holding on. Meanwhile, Earl Maddox was thriving. The Charolais market had exploded just as Pierre predicted. What had been a rare French import in 1971 was now one of the most sought-after beef breeds in America. Cattlemen had discovered what Earl had known for 12 years. Charolais crosses produced more salable beef per pound of feed than any other breed combination. Earl's breeding program was now worth more than most farms in the county. He'd sold the original Hereford herd entirely, converted his whole operation to registered Charolais. His bulls were selling at premium prices, his reputation had spread across 3 states, and his cattle were winning ribbons at the Missouri State Fair. Glenn Kirby hadn't spoken to Earl since the auction in 19. They saw each other in town occasionally, at the feed store, at the diner, at the gas station, but Glenn always looked away, always found something else to focus on. until the spring of 1985. Let me tell you about the auction in 1985, because that's when everything came full circle. The Sedalia Livestock Auction held its annual spring breeding sale on the second Saturday of April, the same day of year as the sale where Earl had bought Blanc 14 years earlier. But this wasn't an ordinary sale. This was a premium registered cattle sale, the kind where serious breeders came from across the region to buy documented genetics. Earl Maddox was consigning 4 bulls. The auction barn was packed. More people than Earl had seen there since the '71 sale. The Charolais market was at its peak, and everyone wanted in. Buyers had come from Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, even Texas. The atmosphere was electric. Earl sat in the back, the same spot he'd occupied 14 years ago. He watched the lots sell, watched the prices climb, waited for his bulls to enter the ring, and then he saw Glenn Kirby walk through the door. Glenn looked different now, thinner, older, with a grayness to his face that hadn't been there in The confidence was gone, too. He walked with his head down, shoulders hunched, looking around the barn like he expected to be recognized and wasn't sure he wanted to be. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Glenn made his way through the crowd and sat down in the seat next to Earl. "Been a while," Glenn said. 14 years. "That's right, 14 years." Glenn was quiet for a moment, watching the auction ring. "I see your bulls are selling today. 4 of them. What are you expecting to get?" "Depends on the bidding. 12, 15,000 for the best one. Maybe more." Glenn nodded slowly. $15,000. "Could be. And that bull you bought in '71, the one I said wouldn't last the summer, blank. He died last year, 14 years old. Good life for a bull. And his bloodline?" Earl gestured at the sale catalog. 4 of his sons selling today. 23 of his grandsons on farms across Missouri. 200 head of registered Charolais in my breeding program, every one of them tracing back to him, all from a $75 bull. "That's right." Glenn was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was lower, soft enough that only Earl could hear. "I owe you an apology." Earl didn't respond. "What I said at that auction, what I said about you, I was wrong. I was showing off, trying to get a laugh, and I was wrong. You saw something nobody else saw, and I made you a laughingstock for it." "You did. I'm sorry, Earl." The auctioneer's voice cut through the moment. "Lot 57, ladies and gentlemen. Registered Charolais bull, 4 years old, sired by Maddox Blanc, documented bloodline tracing to original French imports. We'll start the bidding at $8,000. Earl watched his bull enter the ring. The animal was magnificent, cream-colored like his father, but filled out now, heavy with muscle, the kind of bull that made buyers sit up straight. $8,000. Who'll give me 8? Hands shot up around the barn. 8, I've got 8. Who'll give me 9? The bidding climbed. 9,000. 10, 11, 12. I've got 12. Who'll give me 13? 15,000. The voice came from the Texas buyer in the front row. The barn went quiet. $15,000, ladies and gentlemen. Going once, going twice. Sold for $15,000. Earl didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, made a small note in his catalog, and turned back to Glenn Kirby. "Apology accepted," he said. "Just like that? What else is there?" "You were wrong. I was right. 14 years have proved it. What more do you want me to gloat? That's not who I am." Glenn shook his head slowly. "I've been thinking about that day for 14 years, running it over in my mind, trying to figure out how you knew, how you saw what none of us could see. I had help." "What kind of help?" "A letter from France. My cousin Pierre. He worked in the cattle industry there. He told me about Charolais, told me what they were going to be worth, told me to watch for them at auctions because most Americans wouldn't recognize them. A letter. That's all it was. A letter. And the willingness to listen. You could have gotten the same information if you'd looked for it. The breed associations were publishing articles. The livestock magazines were covering it. The knowledge was there for anyone who wanted it. But I didn't look. I already knew everything. That's right. You already knew everything. Glenn sat with that for a long moment. I've lost the dealership, Earl. Bank's taking it next month. 20 years of my life, gone. Earl said nothing. I'm not asking for sympathy. I made my choices. Spent money I didn't have, bought inventory I couldn't sell, thought the good times would last forever. I was wrong about that too. What are you going to do? Glenn laughed, a bitter, tired sound. I don't know. I'm 59 years old, don't know anything but tractors and cattle. He paused. I don't suppose you're hiring. Earl looked at the man who had humiliated him in front of the entire county, who had made him a laughingstock, who had predicted his failure with such confidence that people were still repeating the joke years later. He thought about what his father had said about staying quiet, keeping the advantage. He thought about 14 years of success built on a $75 bet. He thought about what it meant to win, really win, and whether grinding Glenn Kirby into the dirt was part of that. Come out to the farm next week, Earl said. I need someone to help with the spring breeding season. Doesn't pay much, but it's honest work. Glenn's face went through something complicated. Surprise, shame, gratitude, all mixed together. After everything I said? After the way I treated you? That was 14 years ago. We've both gotten older. Maybe we've both gotten wiser. Earl stood up as his second bull entered the ring. I'm not offering you charity, Glenn. I'm offering you a job, hard work, early mornings, cattle that don't care what you used to be. You interested or not? Glenn was quiet for a long time. I'm interested. Then I'll see you Monday, 6 a.m. Don't be late. Earl walked down to watch his bull sell. This one went for $13,000. The next two sold for $11,000 and $12,000. $51,000 in one afternoon from 4 animals descended from a $75 bull that Glenn Kirby had said wouldn't live to see July. Let me tell you what happened next, because the story doesn't end in the auction barn. Glenn Kirby came to work at the Maddox farm on a Monday morning in May 9th. He arrived at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes early, and he worked harder than any hand Earl had ever hired. There was something driving him. Maybe it was the need to prove himself, to show that he could do real work after years behind a desk. Maybe it was gratitude or guilt or some combination of both. Or maybe Glenn Kirby, stripped of his dealership and his status and his certainty about everything, was finally ready to learn. He learned about Charolais cattle. He learned about breeding programs and bloodline documentation and carcass yield percentages. He learned about all the things he'd been too confident to learn when he was selling tractors and making jokes at other men's expense. And Earl taught him, not with lectures or I told you so speeches. That wasn't Earl's way. He taught by example, by quiet explanation, by letting Glenn make mistakes and then helping him understand what had gone wrong. The same way Earl's father had taught him, the same way Pierre's letter had taught him. All those years ago. By 1988, Glenn Kirby was the assistant manager of the Maddox Charolais operation. He knew every animal in the herd, every bloodline, every buyer who might be interested in premium genetics. He'd become in his 60s, the student he should have been in his 30s. You know what I've learned, Glenn said one evening, sitting on Earl's porch after a long day of sorting cattle. I've learned that the things I was most certain about were the things I knew least about. Earl nodded. That bull in 71. I took one look at it and I knew it was worthless. I was so certain. I stood up in front of the whole auction barn and made a fool of myself. And I was wrong. Completely. Absolutely wrong. Most people would have made the same mistake. Maybe. But most people didn't stand up and announce it to the world. Glenn shook his head. That's what I can't forgive myself for. Not being wrong, everyone's wrong sometimes. It was being so loud about it, so proud of it, making you into a joke when you were the only one who saw the truth. The past is past, Glenn. Is it? I remember that day like it was yesterday. Remember the sound of my own voice, calling out that you should dig a grave. Remember the whole barn laughing. Remember the look on your face. What look? Calm. Like none of it touched you. Like you knew something we didn't know. I thought you were just too dumb to be embarrassed. Turns out you were too smart to care. Earl sipped his coffee. Pierre told me something in one of his letters. He said, "The man who knows something valuable has a choice. He can share it or he can use it. If he shares it, everyone benefits, but no one owes him anything. If he uses it, he benefits most, but he has to endure being misunderstood." You chose to be misunderstood. I chose to wait. 14 years. And now everyone understands. Let me tell you about the last thing, because it's the thing that matters most. Earl Maddox died in 2003, at the age of 80. He'd spent 32 years building the Maddox Charolais operation into one of the most respected breeding programs in the Midwest. His cattle had won ribbons at state fairs across the country. His bloodlines were in herds from Texas to Montana. The bull that cost him $75 had founded a genetic legacy worth millions. Glenn Kirby spoke at the funeral. He was 81 years old by then. Retired from the farm but still living in the county. Still telling the story of the 1971 auction to anyone who would listen. "I knew Earl Maddox for 50 years, Glenn said, standing at the front of the church. For the first 20 of those years, I thought he was a fool. For the last 30, I knew he was the wisest man I ever met. In 1971, I stood up in an auction barn and told the whole county that Earl Maddox was throwing his money away on a sick bull. I said that animal wouldn't live to see July. I was so certain, so proud of my own certainty, that I made Earl into a joke. That bull lived 14 years. His bloodline is still producing champions, and Earl Maddox never once, not in all the years I knew him, threw my words back in my face. He could have. Lord knows he earned the right. But that wasn't who Earl was. He didn't need to gloat because he knew the truth. The truth was in his pastures, in his cattle, in the checks he deposited every spring when the bulls sold. The truth didn't need to be shouted from a podium. It just needed to be lived. Earl taught me something about humility. He taught me that the loudest voice in the room is usually the most ignorant. He taught me that real knowledge is quiet, patient, willing to wait 14 years to be proved right. And he taught me that when you've been wrong, really badly wrong, the only honorable thing to do is admit it and change. I've spent the last 18 years trying to be more like Earl Maddox. I'm still trying. I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying. Earl, if you're listening, thank you. Thank you for the job when I needed one. Thank you for the lessons I didn't deserve. Thank you for being the kind of man who could forgive 14 years of mockery and see something worth saving in the man who mocked you. Rest easy, old friend. The herd's in good hands. Let me tell you one final thing, because it's what Earl would have wanted you to know. The Maddox Charolais operation is still running today. Earl's granddaughter, a woman named Sarah, took it over after her father's death in She's the third generation of Maddox cattle farmers, and she's carrying on the program Earl started with that $75 bull. On a shelf in the barn office, next to the breeding records and registration papers, there's a framed photograph from It shows Blanc as a yearling, skinny, pale, ribs showing, the picture of an animal that looked sick to anyone who didn't know better. Below the photograph is the letter from Pierre, carefully preserved in a glass frame. The paper is yellowed now, fragile with age, but the words are still legible. And below the letter is a small brass plaque that Sarah's father had made, years ago, to commemorate the beginning of everything. It reads, blank, Berlimel Picaritsim Ismail, 1984, purchased, $75. Value of his descendants, beyond calculation. The things we are most certain about are the things we know least about. Glenn Kirby, 1985. That plaque tells the whole story, really. A skinny bull, a quiet farmer, a crowd of laughing men who knew they were right, and 14 years of patience, proving them all wrong.